our last lecture, we were looking at the ways in which the Industrial Revolution transformed the society and also contributed to the emergence of a new kind of economic theory. And I want to continue talking about the ways in which people responded to this Industrial Revolution in this lecture. And it's important because the 19th century industrialists and economic theorists who wrote in support of the new industrial capitalism helped to create a whole new conception of progress. One of the interesting things about this idea of progress that we've talked about before is that it gradually was transformed in the course of the early 19th century. In the beginning, when people argued about progress, they tended to focus on science or on certain kinds of knowledge. But by the 19th century, people came to see the economy as a remarkable example of modern human progress. And economic progress came to be equated with a general social progress. And this idea of economic progress, is a theme that has endured in European thought. In fact, it's spread all around the world, so that in our own time, the very notion of modernization, been a very common theme in the 20th century, emerges out of this 19th century idea that economic progress is a fundamental form of progress. So since the early 19th century, industrialization has been viewed as the hallmark of a modern, productive social system. But the rise of industry within a capitalist market system also provoked the development of a new critical social theory. There's not only a celebration of economic progress, there began to be a critique of economic progress, or at least the form in which it was evolving. And so this is what we need to look at in this lecture. From the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or at least by the beginning of the 19th century, the critique of industrialization was evolving in two rather different directions. Some critics looked back at an earlier agrarian age and complained that industrial progress was destroying the pastoral beauty of nature. They complained that nature itself was suffering from this dramatic change in the technology and industrial system. And this theme became prominent among some Romantic writers. And it marked the beginning of what we might now call environmentalism, although that's a word that was not yet used in the early period. But the critique that industry itself was defacing nature was already present in certain forms of early Romanticism. But other critics were more willing to embrace industrialization. They didn't deny that it was a valuable change. But these critics argued that the system must be reorganized to benefit the workers. And this theme, the theme that workers needed to benefit more from the industrial system, this theme extended the egalitarian ideas of the French Revolution from politics into economic life and marked the beginning of what soon came to be known as socialism. Both the environmentalists, to use a more recent term, and the socialists believed that important aspects of an older world were disappearing. Natural beauty, social community, some kind of life in common. This was being lost. And yet these critics were not simply nostalgic for a lost world. And the socialists in particular developed numerous plans for a better future world. They weren't simply dreaming of the past. They began to develop plans to reconstruct the future. So what I want to do in this lecture is to look briefly at the Romantic critique of industrialization, a critique that tended to drift off toward an environmental critique. And then I want to discuss three of the most influential early socialist theorists, Robert Owen, Henri Saint-Simon, and Charles Fourier. These writers all became known in intellectual history as utopian socialists, although in their own lives, in their own early careers, they weren't called utopian socialists. This was a term that was developed by Marx and later Marxist socialists to criticize the earlier socialists. So these first socialists were criticized by later Marxist socialists, and they were also criticized by almost all conventional economists in the 19th century. And yet their critiques of competition and inequality in modern capitalist economies also attracted the interest and support of many people who were worried about the new social inequalities and social miseries under the industrial system. And so I want to look at their theories and why they were important. But before I look at the early socialists, I want to say a word about the Romantic poets and the Romantic philosophers and try to suggest what their critique emphasized. The Romantic poets complained that new industries and the cities that grew up around them were defacing nature, that industry destroyed natural beauty. And the Romantics often stressed, as we've seen earlier, the Romantics often stressed the spiritual elements of nature. But industrialization seemed to use nature only as a source of raw materials. It created ugly cities, it defaced the landscape, it took down trees, it covered over fields. It seemed to be defacing the beauty of the natural world. And many of the Romantics said that such cities, the new industrial cities, caused misery for people as well as problems for nature, and that all of this was somehow unnatural. And remember, it was an important theme of Romantic thought was to celebrate the value and the beauty of nature. So Romantic poets such as Shelley was a very important critic of industrialization. Romantic poets such as Shelley condemned the unnatural aspects of industry, which harmed nature, but also harmed the workers. In fact, Shelley could see nothing natural in the new industrial system, and he wrote bitter poems about it. He was one of the most socially and politically conscious poetic leaders or poetic figures in the Romantic movement. He wrote a poem called Song to the Men of England, which later became a kind of socialist lyric. And in this poem, Shelley reminds the workers, the words of the poems remind the workers that they are not benefiting from their own labor. He wrote, "The robes ye weave, another wears. The arms ye forge, another bears. The robes you weave, another wears. The arms ye forge, another bears." That someone is taking away from you what is rightfully yours. And Shelley began to urge workers to assert their rights to a just reward for their work. But Romantic writers who complained about the defacement of nature or the misery of modern workers didn't really work out a plan for social reform. They didn't really spend their time thinking how it could all be changed. In fact, many of the poets, not Shelley, but many of the Romantic poets, simply held a sentimental view of an earlier world that had been lost. For example, the Middle Ages. They would think nostalgically about the way the world had been before the modern age began. And from this perspective, the Romantic, sentimental perspective, industrialization itself was the problem. But this was not a perspective that could be carried very far because it was almost impossible to think how one could turn the system back. So most social theorists recognized there was no going back to an earlier agrarian age. A new world was being created, and as much as some people might yearn for the world that had been lost, it simply couldn't be recreated. And so the other critique of industrialization and the other critique of early political economists began to emerge among socialists who sought to change the industrial system, not abolish it, but they wanted to change the industrial system because they understood that industries and cities were inevitably shaping a new social world. There was no getting around it, so the question is, how can it be reconstructed or reformed? Now, the term socialism actually began to emerge by the 1830s. It became a fairly common word, and the early socialists, some of the early socialists, were close to the Romantics in attacking industry itself. There were some socialists who dreamed of something like pre-industrial agrarian communes, kind of a back-to-the-earth ideal. But most socialists argued that industrialization itself was not the problem. The problems emerged in a specific economic system that was developing the new industries, and this was the capitalist market system. Now, socialists generally argued against doctrines that said competition was the most natural form of human behavior. This had been one of the claims of the classical economists. It had been a part of Adam Smith's argument. Competition is the natural form of human activity. But the socialists rejected this claim, and they also rejected the claim that private ownership of property brought the most good to the most people. In a sense, they were adopting that utilitarian argument that Bentham had developed, but they were saying, unlike the utilitarians, they were saying, in fact, capitalism does not bring the most good to the most people. It brings only the most good to a small minority. So socialists sought to develop plans that stressed cooperation over competition. And they said this would bring more benefits to the whole society, to the majority of people. And they said that human cooperation was actually more natural than competition. They argued that cooperation was in fact what is most characteristic of human beings. It's what separates them from other animals, for example. They said that cooperation is the basis of human life within families, within nations, within social institutions. And to argue that competition is the most characteristic form of human life, they said, is a distortion. And this actually raises an interesting question. How much of human life depends most of all on cooperation with our friends, our colleagues, our families, our co-workers, and how much depends on competition? One can make an argument in both directions. But for the socialists, it was cooperation that needed to be highlighted. But they complained that the classical economists looked only at competition. And they also rejected the claims of Ricardo and Malthus, who had said that most people must live at subsistence level wages. We talked about that in the last lecture. Socialists said this is not natural. They rejected Ricardo's argument that the iron law of wages was based on a law of nature. They, in fact, went back to the ideas of writers such as Rousseau, who had said that equality is the natural condition. That in a state of nature, if you were really going to think about what is the natural human condition, equality rather than economic and social hierarchy is the more natural condition. But the socialists also built their arguments on claims that went beyond social egalitarianism. They said it would be more rational to create an economic system that avoided the chaotic economic cycles of the laissez-faire system. So they not only made this sort of moral or philosophical argument about human cooperation or human nature or equality, they also tried to make the practical argument that the current capitalist system was so unstable that there was something irrational about it. That a more rational system would be more clearly planned out, that a more rational system would avoid the cycles that somehow disrupted the normal social life of the people who lived in the community. Now, many of these general assumptions appeared in the work of early socialists. They were ideas held in common by many socialists, but there were several socialists who elaborated these themes in greatest detail. And what I want to do now is turn to a brief overview of the socialists who, as I said earlier, came to be known as the utopian socialist. I want to talk about Robert Owen, who lived between 1771 and 1858. Owen, who was British. I want to talk about Henri Saint-Simon, who was French, lived between 1760 and 1825. And I'm going to talk about Charles Fourier, who lived between 1772 and 1858 and was also French. I'm sorry, he lived till, I think, 1837, not 1858. These people differed, but they all criticized capitalism. They had a different view of the capitalist system. First of all, they shared the idea of creating more cooperative societies which would work for the common good rather than for private property or private profits. That was the fundamental theme of all of these writers. Now, Owen was originally Welsh, from a rather humble background, but he became the owner of a cotton mill in Manchester, which made him a very wealthy man. He was an ambitious and energetic person. He came to the attention of certain industrialists, and they put him in a managerial position, and eventually he came to own his own cotton mill. But he, with this wealth, he decided he wanted to go into business himself, and so he purchased a cotton mill and set himself up in business. But he became convinced that laissez-faire economic practices were ruining the workers and that the industrial environment destroyed their character. He complained that neither the capitalists nor the churches did enough to improve the lives of workers. And Owen therefore purchased a cotton factory in Scotland, where he created a new kind of ideal factory town with shorter work hours, better working conditions, cooperative stores, and a school for the children. This would be a new kind of industrial system. And he called this community New Lanark. He suggested that in this community there would be a greater emphasis on cooperation, and he claimed that by cooperating and by being adequately rewarded, the workers actually produced more and better cotton thread than the workers in other factories. He made the argument that it's in the interest of everyone to give the workers better conditions and to give them a better reward. And Owen wrote about his community, New Lanark, began to publish articles about it, and argued that a cooperative factory system should be adopted throughout England because it would benefit everyone. He wanted to found other New Lanark factories in communities around the country, and he went to the Parliament. He tried to convince people in the British government that they should support his project. He spoke to both economists and political leaders, but his plans did not gain much support. He was dismissed as something of a crackpot or an idealist who lacked practical projects. And so he gave up on his plan to create factories of the New Lanark model around Britain, and he decided to go off to America, which was seen as the place where you could try anything, you could create a new project. And he went to southern Indiana, where he purchased property and created a place called New Harmony, which was going to be the new cooperative community. This was in about 1824. But this kind of utopian community, which would be based on cooperation and equal kinds of rewards, depended on a very strong leader, somebody like Robert Owen himself. But Owen, after getting the community set up, went back to Britain, and shortly after he left, people in the community began to dispute, to have arguments, to have problems, and the community fell apart. This seemed to be the problem of many of these utopian communities. They needed a strong leader to give them shape. But in any case, this plan, the plan of New Harmony, did not really provide a general social model because it was an isolated village rather than a complex modern city. And this was one of the problems that many of the early socialists ran into. They were creating isolated communities, or they had a plan for an isolated community rather than a plan for actually transforming places that already existed. And it was obviously impractical to move everyone out of cities into small villages in the countryside. That wasn't going to happen. So even though Owen had an idea of an alternative factory system, it really didn't have a possibility of being generally adopted as a solution for the problems of the new economy. So this leads us to the second important socialist, Saint-Simon, who among the early contributors to socialism may have had the greatest appreciation for the actually emerging industrial economy. He seemed to appreciate the complexity of the new system. Saint-Simon was from an old noble family in France. He had come from a privileged background, and he had been a military officer as a young man. He actually served in the French army that went to America during the American Revolution. And he was very interested in American society and what he observed there. And after he went back to France and the French Revolution broke out, Saint-Simon also supported the French Revolution. Unlike many nobles, he continued to support the revolution, and he strongly supported the abolition of the special privileges of the noble class. He didn't think the nobles should have privileges that were not extended to other social classes. At the same time, Saint-Simon developed a deep interest in the new industrial economy. But he thought there would be a way to make it operate more efficiently. Saint-Simon thought laissez-faire ideas were not the most efficient way to operate this new economy. And he thought that a well-planned economy would work much better than one in which everybody was just pursuing their own interests, their own goals. That what was needed was some kind of guidance, some kind of organization that would give it direction. And Saint-Simon assumed that this economy should be led by a talented elite of engineers and scientists who understood modern technology. Such persons were, in his view, the best prepared people to manage the new forces of social and economic life. So he didn't want to simply turn the economy loose. He wanted to have a structured system. Now, unlike many of the early socialists, Saint-Simon had a more comprehensive view of history. He said the world had moved through a series of stages, but now it was entering an era in which new scientific elites were replacing the old elites of aristocrats, kings, and clergymen. That in the old days, it was always the kings and the aristocrats who led the society. But he said now these traditional social elites were basically useless in the new world. He was more or less the opposite of someone like Joseph de Maistre, who was writing in this very same period, in the early 19th century, and arguing for a restoration of the power of those elites and of the monarchy. Saint-Simon said, no, these people are not important in the new economy. If we lost all of the scientists and engineers and economic leaders, the society would be in a crisis. If we lost all the bishops, the nobles, and the king, things would go on just as they are. So what we need is a world which would be directed and planned by talented, scientific, and educated elites. And this became a very powerful idea, especially in France, where all the way down to the present, one could say there's a kind of faith in what came to be called later the technocrat, the organizing official, the leader. So Saint-Simon's ideas were adopted by a number of people. They were followed by a number of people in France. And after Saint-Simon's death in 1825, he became something of a cult figure. His followers created a kind of Saint-Simonian religion, which attracted many writers and artists. People began to have meetings in which they would talk about Saint-Simon's vision of the future, in which they saw themselves as the future elites, in which they advocated the reform of the whole society. And many Saint-Simonians also became early advocates for women's rights. Many of the first feminists were also Saint-Simonians who believed that the society could be reorganized in a way that would give more rights to women. And some of the Saint-Simonians also became technical managers in the French government. They came to be active in later regimes, including the Second Empire of Napoleon III. Many of the early Saint-Simonians became officials of later French governments. And so the Saint-Simonians included an interesting mix of idealistic visionaries, people who had an image of a radically reformed society, and a group of practical, science-minded social planners and engineers who believed that they were the legitimate leaders of society and their expertise and know-how would be the way to create a planned society, a more rational, planned economy. Now, the followers of Charles Fourier, the third of these important early socialists, tended to be much more utopian visionaries. They did not have as much of the scientific engineering interest as the Saint-Simonians. And in fact, Fourier himself could probably best be described as a visionary. He wasn't as interested in some of the practical engineering issues that attracted Saint-Simon's interest. As a young man, Fourier worked for various provincial cloth merchants. He was a salesman. He got involved in various kinds of marketing projects. Although we don't know a lot about his early life, we do know that he supported the French Revolution as a young man. But he lived in obscurity almost all of his life until his publications began attracting attention in the 1820s and the 1830s. And then Fourier, like Saint-Simon, began to attract a group of followers who published newspapers, who published articles and books advocating Fourier's system. Now, Fourier could be compared to Robert Owen in that he also wanted to create small cooperative communities in France. He wanted to create small communes. And he said that each of these communes would be called a phalanx. A phalanx would be a community that would include exactly 1,620 people. Fourier, by the way, was obsessed with mathematical precision. He had all of these ideas about numbers, and in order to have a fully harmonious community, you needed to have 1,620 people in the phalanx. And in this commune, you would live, the people in the community would live by what he called an associative principle, and they would create an associative order, a community association. Now, Fourier believed that work must become more satisfying to people because he very strongly believed that most people in the modern world were unhappy in their jobs. Maybe he had been unhappy in his job selling cloth as a traveling salesman. In any case, he believed that whatever people were doing, for the most part, they didn't enjoy their work. And he said that people in modern cities didn't really work in jobs that interested them. They just got up and went to work, but they didn't really do anything that they had a passion for. So they were unhappy. They weren't satisfied. But in the phalanx, in this commune, each person would work in ways that fit his or her own nature or passion. And this would create an ideal division of labor. So, for example, boys who loved dirt and debris would be in charge of managing the garbage. What a perfect fit. You take care of the garbage because you like dirt. Or the people who love fruit would be in charge of the orchards. Each person's job would fit their own passion. They would be happy. They would spend their days doing what they wanted to do. And then everyone would also receive their fair share of the money that the community economy would generate. And finally, Fourier's vision of these communes included some kind of gendered equality. He was another early advocate for women's rights, that women and men would be rewarded equally. He also had an idea that in these communes that sexual desires would be freely expressed, that there wouldn't be sexual repression. It would be a more open and loving environment. Well, Fourier's vision of the ideal community attracted the interest of intellectuals, not only in France, but in many other places, people who were looking for alternatives to the emerging industrial society. And some Fourier supporters of Fourier tried to establish new communities around France and in other places, including even in the United States, where the famous Brook Farm community was established in Massachusetts in the 1840s as a Fourier community. But Fourier's system, like Owen's, did not really help people who had to live in modern cities, and it lacked a coherent theory of history. And so there was a need for some kind of more coherent historical theory among the socialist theorists. And this is where the Hegelian historical tradition began to come in to socialism. And what we'll do in the next lecture is turn to this emerging Hegelian social and historical theory and see how it affected early socialism.